comes to us. Okay, I'm going to restart that. Dr. Glass, it comes to us tonight. He is the executive director of the Sing Sing Prison Museum. He comes to us with a rich background in all aspects of public history. In addition to his duties at the Sing Sing Prison Museum, he is the Director Emeritus of the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and Senior Advisor to the National History Academy. While at the National Museum of American History, the third busiest of the Smithsonian museums, he oversaw the largest renovation in its history, which included installation of permanent exhibits, the revitalization of public spaces, and the creation of a new public square on the National Mall, which is used for citizenship naturalization ceremonies and other public events. Prior to his tenure in DC, he was the director of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, which is the largest state history program in the country, with over 25 historic sites and museums, including the State Museum and the State Archives. Not surprisingly, Dr. Glass is in high demand. He has consulted for more than 50 cultural and historic organizations on museum government, museum management, fundraising, and strategic planning. He is also an author and an international speaker. And if you haven't finished building your historic site bucket list, check out his 50 Great American Places, Essential Historic Sites across the country, or across the US. In tonight's program, Sing Sing Prison and the History of Criminal Justice, he will reveal the prison's largely untold history and place it in the context of today's criminal justice issues. Along the way, we will get a sneak peek at the progress of the museum as we approach Sing's 200th anniversary in 2025. So let me turn it now over to Brent Glass.
Well, thank you, Martha. That's a wonderful introduction, and I'm delighted to be with the Jug Tavern Association tonight. I see as people were entering the room, the Zoom room, a number of familiar faces and friends. First, I want to thank Doug Turchin for inviting me to speak tonight. Also recognize Rochelle Udell, who is former board member of the Prison Museum. I'm happy to see her. Sandy Galiff is a great friend and a great support for the Prison Museum. I can safely say we would not be where we are today, on the verge of making some amazing strides forward without Sandy Galiff's early vision and early support. So I want to recognize what she has done for the Prison Museum and for the community as she prepares to leave her current job, but I think she's going to stay engaged in the community in many ways. I also have to recognize that my sister is in the audience. I just noticed her sign in from Providence, Rhode Island, Jody Glass. So she'll probably say she doesn't get to see me except on a Zoom meeting like this, but I'm happy to see that she's here. And I'd like to get right into the program. So Martha's going to help me and share the screen, and I look forward to your questions as we move ahead. The Sing Sing Prison Museum has a small but dedicated staff. The names you see on this list are all part-timers, and we are working on program planning, facility planning, fundraising, strategic planning, and it's a good tight group. And fortunately, and we'll go to the next slide, we have a wonderful board of directors. Rochelle was formerly a member of that board, and the board adopted this mission statement, which basically has two major elements. First, we want to tell the 200-year history of Sing Sing, an extraordinary history. Every chapter in the history of criminal justice has a few pages written at Sing Sing, and we want to use that history as a resource to understand our own times, to challenge all of us to imagine a more equitable criminal justice system and build a better society. So the board adopted this mission 3 years ago, and this is our guiding principle. Next slide. And we challenge all of us to ask the basic question, why do we have prisons? We suggest a few answers here on this slide, but I hope that this program and other programs that we've been sponsoring will cause the audience and our visitors to ask the basic question, why do we have prisons? Next slide. We at the Sing Sing Prison Museum are telling stories, and to help me remember how to organize the storytelling, I've divided our story into 5 chapters: the river, the rocks, the railroad, the ruin, and reform. Next slide. So when we talk about the river, that's a fundamental reason why Sing Sing Prison is located where it is. It's the 3rd prison that was built in New York State, the first being in Greenwich Village at Newgate Prison, the 2nd in Auburn State Prison near Syracuse, and the 3rd in 1825 near the village of Sing Sing in the township of Mount Pleasant. And the location along the river was important because this was the major thoroughfare at that point in New York, and a place that was near New York City and was affordable to the state legislature. And some of the debates in the legislature about how much money to spend on acquiring and building the prisons those debates are very entertaining. But this site along the Hudson River was chosen in 1825. Next slide. And so Elam Linds, who was the warden at Auburn State Prison near Syracuse, remember the Erie Canal had just been completed in 1825, and he assembled 114 incarcerated men at Auburn State Prison, went down the canal, then landed in Albany, and then on their way to down the Hudson River to Sing Sing in Westchester County. Next slide. The men began working on their own, building their own prison. And this is an early image of, on the right is an early image of the prison that they built. Ironically, and I think an important point, is that the Hudson River was becoming known for the Hudson River School of Art. And so the Hudson River and the scenery and natural beauty of the Hudson River were inspiring artists at the very time that this enormous prison was being built on the banks of the Hudson River. Next slide. The prison attracted attention almost immediately. And one of the early visitors to the prison in 1831 was Alexis de Tocqueville and his companion, Gustave de Beaumont. And their original assignment when they came to America was to assess the penitentiary system in the US. The French believed, and many of Western Europeans believed, that this new democracy, the United States in the 1820s was still a relatively new democracy. And they felt they could find some answers to the basic question, why do we have prisons? So de Tocqueville visited Sing Sing in May 1831, and he visited several other prisons. And he concluded that, as you'll read here, while the society in the US gives examples of extended liberty, the prisons offered the spectacle of the most complete despotism. And what de Tocqueville discovered was that Elam Linds, the warden at Sing Sing, had applied a system called the Auburn system, where the emphasis was on solitude, silence, and suffering. Next slide. The prison that was built by the men from Auburn was the largest, one of the largest structures in the United States at that time. This is in the late 1820s, 1830s. This is an image of a plan and a elevation of the prison from 1831. So this is what de Tocqueville would have seen. And so the other reason along with the riverfront location, the other reason for locating the Sing Sing prison at this site was the presence of what was called an inexhaustible supply of limestone, of rocks. So the river, now the rocks, was a fundamental resource for building Sing Sing prison. And this is a good point to recognize that long before Sing Sing prison was built, this was an area that was settled by indigenous peoples. The name Sing Sing comes from a indigenous dialect that meant stone on stone. The name Ossining, which is now the name of the village, meant a stony place. So the presence of the indigenous peoples is built into the DNA of Sing Sing prison. The image that you're looking at now is very important. The middle image is of the cell block itself. This was the building in which the men were incarcerated. The image at the top is a stone enclosure that surrounds the cell block. But the cell block and the stone enclosure are two independent buildings. The cell block was located inside with about a 10-foot separation all around the building, a 10-foot separation between the cell block and the stone enclosure. So the image at the bottom of this slide is a plan of the prison, which shows you the let's see if we can, the catwalk around the cell block, about a 10-foot section separating, a 10-foot walkway separating the stone enclosure from the cell block itself. There were 200 cells on each floor, and there were originally 4 floors or tiers, so 800 prisoners were incarcerated at the beginning. By 1831, they had increased the size of the prison by 1 tier, adding another 200 cells. And then right before the Civil War, they added another 200 cells on another tier. So there were 6 tiers altogether, and housing 1,200 men. However, as time went on, the idea of individual cellular confinement, which was a basic principle of the Auburn system, was compromised because they began doubling up in some of these cells. Next slide. The cells themselves, the cells were no bigger than a yoga mat. They were 3 feet 3 inches wide, 7 feet long, and 6.5 feet high. The idea behind the Auburn system was to house the men in these tiny cells at night, and during the day they were out working, mostly breaking rock in the stone quarries around the prison and shipping that stone up and down the Hudson River as construction stone. So that would the basic idea was that the business model was that Sing Sing would pay for itself by producing various products, including construction stone, and that the men would work during the day, sleeping in these small cells at night. These cells were not only small, but there was very little ventilation. There was no indoor plumbing, no electricity. They used the bucket system for water coming in and wastewater coming out. It was a very grim condition. And as you might imagine, almost a petri dish for whatever epidemics or whatever diseases were sweeping through the community at that time. Next slide. So the discipline the discipline philosophy at Sing Sing was a big part of the story here. The lockstep was a familiar way of moving men around the prison yards as they went to different workspaces. Next slide. Corporal punishment was liberally administered at least until the 1840s, when the legislature attempted to outlaw or ban corporal punishment. But the idea behind solitude in these small cells, silence, there was a big emphasis on restricting communication between the men, and then the suffering of hard work and corporal punishment reflected the penal philosophy at Sing Sing, all the way through the end of the 19th century. Next slide. At the same time, there was a women's prison at Sing Sing. In the 1830s, some of the women were even housed in a section of the cell block that I showed you earlier. And then by 1839, a new female prison was built on the hill overlooking the male prison in this Greek Revival style building. About 100 women were incarcerated at Sing Sing at different times between 1839 and 1877, when the women's prison closed. Next slide. So we talked about the river, we talked about rocks, and the railroad. The railroad came in 1849. This was the New York Central Railroad, and it had a profound impact on Sing Sing. Sing Sing already had developed a reputation for producing a variety of products, including building stone. But once the railroad came in, a small industrial complex built up around the male prison. Next slide. So this is an image from about the 1870s, and you see the cell block, the main cell block that I mentioned earlier, called the male prison. The female prison is up on the hill overlooking the river, and small shops were built between the cell block and the river. These shops were places where the men made hats and buckles and shoes, and it became a well-known product, a production center in the 1870s and 1880s. Next slide. This is from 1881, and you see here the female prison is still here, but it's now housing the overflow of prisoners who could not fit into the male prison, which is here. You see the rock quarries all surrounding the prison, and these various shops and manufacturing centers are built up, and each shop had a contract with a private contractor. The biggest contract was with a producer of cast iron stoves, and there are every once in a while we come across someone who has a cast iron stove made at Sing Sing. But the production of inexpensive goods at Sing Sing became an issue, and by the 1890s, the legislature banned the production of banned products made at the prison, except for what they called state use. So Sing Sing could no longer manufacture products that would be sold on the open market. Their products could only be sold to other state agencies. Eventually, as the automobile became more popular in the early 20th century, Sing Sing and other prisons in New York began manufacturing license plates for the use of the Department of Motor Vehicles. Next slide. This is two insurance maps. The Sanborn Map Company produced these maps periodically, and these two are really quite interesting. You see on the right, this is from around 1897. The blue building here is the cell block that I've showed that was built in 1825. It's still in use. The female prison is still there. but it's being used as an overflow for the male prison. There's no longer a female prison. There's a death house here because in 1891, Sing Sing began executing individuals in this building. Some of the shops are still located along the riverfront. And then by 1911, because the manufacturing was being for private sale was banned, a number of the shops were torn down, and Sing Sing starts to reduce its complex of buildings, so that by the 1920s or 1930s, it is no longer a manufacturing center. Another building that's shown here in 1911, I'm sorry, in 1925, is the death house, which was a new building that was built for the purpose of capital punishment. You also see in the cell block here, this vacant area shows that New York State had started to tear down or demolish the old cell block. The walls of the cell block had remained, but they were building a new prison on the west side of the railroad. This is the railroad tracks, building a new prison, which is the one that we see today that developed in the 1920s. Next slide. So here's what remains of the original cell block of Sing Sing. The cell block itself is gone. What remains is the stone enclosure, which is an extraordinary ruin. And this is one of our objectives of the Sing Sing Prison Museum, is to bring visitors into this structure, which right now no one sees. After the last prisoners were housed at Sing Sing was in the 1940s. And after that time, this structure was vacant. There was a roof on the building, and it was used for light manufacturing and storage. There was also a boxing ring here. You see this concrete pad. So there was a boxing ring within the structure. In 1984, there was a fire that destroyed the roof of the old stone enclosure. And since that time, for the last nearly 40 years, this building has been vacant and is just sitting sturdily, but in some need of preservation and stabilization, and hopefully a chance for people to actually visit this building. And we have a plan for that, and we'll mention that in a minute. Next slide. So I've talked about the river, the rocks, the railroad, the ruin, and now I just want to mention a little bit about reform, because right from the beginning of Sing Sing, there were a recognition of this, trying to answer this question, why do we have prisons? And there were organizations, this is a report from one of the leading organizations, the Prison Discipline Society, that were trying to raise questions about whether prisons could be used for rehabilitation, or certainly trying to discourage the use of corporal punishment, more humane treatment of prisoners. But in general, these organizations did not have a very big impact. Next slide. One of the most innovative reformers actually was at Sing Sing, Eliza Farnham. She was called the matron of the women's prison, and she only served in that position for about 3 or 4 years in the 1840s. Here's another image of the female prison. But during that time, she introduced new discipline practices. She taught the women reading and music and art and different crafts. And she believed that a more humane disciplinary treatment of the women would produce a better effect. And so she also was a phrenologist, a pseudoscience of the 19th century, where she believed that you could determine behavior by analyzing the skull, the ridges on your skull. But Eliza Farnham was friends with Horace Greeley. She was friends with Margaret Fuller, a number of the transcendentalists. A really interesting person. We want to develop more information about her work at Sing Sing and her life in general. Next slide. Another major reformer was Thomas Mott Osborne, who was a member of a very prominent family in Auburn, New York. He was warden at Sing Sing for a very brief amount of time, 1914 to 1916, but he was visionary and progressive at a time when the progressive movement was very strong in this country. And one of his innovations, next slide, was called the Mutual Welfare League. This was a form of self-government in which Thomas Mott Osborne and the prisoners and the men incarcerated at Sing Sing developed their own constitution, their own code of discipline, their own currency, some of which you see here. They had their own band, their own recreational programs, and it was a revolutionary concept to turn authority in the prison over to the men who were incarcerated. And after, but it was so revolutionary that Osborne was pushed out of his position by some of the powers in Albany. But some of the work of the Mutual Welfare League continued on into the 1930s. And today we have the Osborne Association, which is named for Thomas Mott Osborne. And it has incorporated many of the programs of the Mutual Welfare League. Next slide. Another major reformer was Lewis Laws, who was the longest serving warden at Sing Sing from 1920 to 1941. He was one of the first professionally trained criminologists and penologists in the country. And he kept some of the programs of the Mutual Welfare League. In the 1920s is the emergence of radio and motion pictures, and Lewis Laws was promoted more entertainment, more humane treatment for the prisoners, and became the most famous warden in America. Next slide. He befriended the Warner Brothers. He had a number of films made at Sing Sing, and Laws himself was a frustrated playwright and scriptwriter, and some of his scripts were produced by the Warner Brothers, and the Warner Brothers, as a thank you to Lewis Laws, built the gymnasium, which is at Sing Sing in 1934. This is an image of the interior of that gymnasium. The gymnasium is no longer in use now, but it is potentially a building that could be reused in the future. Next slide. As I said, Laws was the most famous warden in the country. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was a thought leader. He was very influential in calling attention to prison conditions. Next slide, the one reform that he could not change was capital punishment. And this is the electric chair at Sing Sing. 614 people were executed at Sing Sing between 1891 and 1963, when a capital punishment was finally suspended in New York and then later banned by the legislature. The most famous execution, next slide, was the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. And in 1953, and I believe, and I want to correct me, but I think there's a connection with the Jug Tavern with this execution. Am I correct that the media, the night of that execution, gathered at Jug Tavern? Can anybody confirm that in the audience?
No, I can't.
I have no idea, but I know the person to ask. So I'll have to get back to everybody on that.
I read that there was so much international coverage of this event that the media spilled over and actually
Maybe Dudley's.
convened at the
Yeah, from what I understand, they gathered at Dudley's at the time. and that's a place where a number of the journalists met, which is right around the corner from the tavern.
Oh, okay, all right. Next slide. The,
Trouble moving them. Just give me 1 second. I don't know.
okay,
See what's happening here. See if we can get it restarted there. Okay.
okay. I'm sorry to throw you off.
Oh, no, it's not you. Thank you.
The, the Rosenberg execution inspired writers and artists and creative people, and Andy Warhol produced these images of the electric chair at Sing Sing in the 1960s, and he went back to this subject repeatedly in his career. Next slide. So the story now that we're talking about is the rise of mass incarceration in the United States. This is an image from really starting in the 1970s and 80s and 90s and on into the early 20th century. There was a dramatic rise in incarceration in New York and throughout the country, and especially racialized incarceration, people of color serving in prison in disproportionate numbers. This image is from Eastern State Penitentiary, which is in Philadelphia. And the story behind Eastern State is equally interesting to the story of Sing Sing, because there the philosophy was solitary confinement and influenced by the Quakers of Philadelphia. We won't go into that right now, but that historic site has incorporated into its program a number of contemporary issues, including the rise of mass incarceration. Next slide. So here's an aerial view of the prison, at least the section of the prison that we're dealing with. Here's the river, the wastewater treatment plant that the county operates, some buildings that are used for educational purposes at Sing Sing. The wall at Sing Sing now the perimeter wall goes as far north as the former powerhouse, which is just on the other side of the wall. The Lewis Engel Park is just off to the right here, and the train station is off to the right. It's about a 10-minute walk from the train station to the Sing Sing powerhouse. Our plan originally was to use the powerhouse as location of the museum. We still will probably use some parts of the powerhouse in the future, but the cost of developing this structure is just beyond our reach. And so we're looking at other sites for the museum. But we do plan to bring visitors into the old cell block by a walkway around the perimeter wall. This is a ball field, and I should mention this is where the ball field where Babe Ruth hit one of his longest home runs, and I'll mention that in a moment. But we'll bring visitors from this on the west side of the prison through a secure gate. They will surrender their Fitbits and their cell phones and cameras, and will enter. They will be inside the prison, and they will walk along this walkway to the east, and then will let's see. And then they will walk south into the old cell block. This is the Warner Brothers Gymnasium that I mentioned earlier. They'll come in about 100 feet. The cell block itself is 476 feet long. We don't need to bring people all the way in to the cell block. And furthermore, this area is used occasionally for recreational purposes by the men who are incarcerated. And we don't want to have any, we don't want to interfere with their lives and with the operation of the facility. So we're going to keep the visitors in a section of the cell block on the north end of that structure. Next slide. Right. At this point, we're looking at another location for the museum, the old Olive Opera House, which is on Central Avenue and Brandreth Street in Ossining. And this is a wonderful building, a historic building that we're looking at to develop at first a preview center in a small space off of Central Avenue. And we're considering the possibility of using other spaces within the Olive Opera House. Next slide. We're continuing to collect and add to our collection. I mentioned Babe Ruth hitting his longest home run. This baseball was from someone who attended that exhibition game that day, and this ball was not in play, but was the Yankees. Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and many others signed hundreds of baseballs, and we were lucky enough to acquire one a few years ago. We also are acquiring some handmade items that were made at the prison. This is a cane made at the prison by incarcerated men and presented to the warden at that time. Next slide. We're sponsoring art programs, performances. This was a dance performance that took place in Lewis Engel Park called The Wait Room. It was about the experience of women and families waiting to see their loved ones in prison. A new production by the same choreographer, Joe Kreider, will take place on October 7th and 8th this year. And we hope all of you will attend. This is being sponsored by Bethany Arts Community, so the event will take place at Bethany, and the Sing Sing Prison Museum is one of the sponsors of that event. Next slide. We are working closely with the Ossining school system. We sponsored a curriculum in criminal justice studies, which is offered to seniors at Ossining High School. And we also, as part of that curriculum, they visit historic sites associated with the history of criminal justice. And here they are visiting Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Next slide. We sponsor a series of webinars called Justice Talks. The next one will be next week on September 21st, a preview of the discussing the dance performance that will take place at Bethany Arts Community. And the Justice Talks webinars cover historical topics and also contemporary issues, such as capital punishment, policing, wrongful conviction, solitary confinement, a number of contemporary issues that fulfill our mission. Next slide. We have a mobile app that we've developed so that you can download the app called Stone on Stone. And there's a 3D model of the old cell block and a cell from Sing Sing that you can tap various parts of those structures and learn more about the history of Sing Sing. Next slide. We also feature a number of people who formerly incarcerated who have shared their story with us. We had a wonderful poetry reading program in April of this year. And Mimi Pascal is a museum associate with us who we met through the Center of Justice at Columbia University. Next slide. We offer waterfront tours of the sites along the waterfront that are associated with Sing Sing history. And we'll continue to do that as we develop the preview center and the museum in Ossining. Next slide. We work with a number of partners in addition to Bethany Arts Community and Rehabilitation Through the Arts. Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison is a close partner of ours, and Sean Pica, who's the executive director, is the secretary of our board. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation. I should mention that in addition to the webinar next week and the dance performance, in the beginning of October 7th and 8th. On November 3rd, put this on your calendar, we're going to have a screening of a film at the Jacob Burns Film Center in Pleasantville. And this film was first produced in 1972. So it's the 50th anniversary of a concert that took place at Sing Sing featuring Joan Baez, B.B. King, and a number of other musicians. And the filmmaker, David Hoffman, will join us and talk about the making of Thanksgiving 1972 at Sing Sing. So it's a really special event that we're thrilled to have the partnership with Jacob Burns Film Center. You see our different ways for you to join us and find out more information on our website or on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Please stay involved and stay connected with us. And now I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Dr. Glass a question. You can unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it into the chat at the bottom of your screen and we'll make sure it gets asked. Don't be shy.
Dr. Glass, I'm wondering if, oh, I guess there's some hands raised, but I'll just quickly jump in. Is the approach of the Sing Sing Prison Museum unique in terms of other prison museums, either in the United States or elsewhere?
Well, I think there are some models that we're paying attention to. The one difference between the Sing Sing project and many of the other prison museums around the country or in other countries is that that Sing Sing Correctional Facility is still an operating facility. And so we want to work closely with the Department of Corrections in establishing our program and not interfering with the work that they do. Eastern State Penitentiary is a good model for us, but that prison was closed, that penitentiary was closed in the early 1970s. Alcatraz Island is very well known as a federal prison, federal penitentiary, but it was closed in the late 1960s. There's another state prison in Louisiana, Angola State Prison, that has a museum that is operated by the state. So the difference here is that we will be operated by an independent nonprofit board of trustees. So there are a few models. There is a prison consortium, a prison museum consortium, I should say, that we belong to. There's also an international coalition of sites of conscience that we belong to that is a network of historic places that address issues of justice, of trauma, that I think offer some examples for us as we navigate this challenge of engaging visitors in a subject that can sometimes be depressing and sometimes be discouraging, but we want to take it seriously. We also understand that people are interested in great escapes and celebrity prisoners, and we will certainly, when the context is appropriate, we will talk about that. But we think there's an audience for people who understand that the justice system affects all of us, and that even though these places are often in remote areas or out of sight, that the issues that we're talking about are important issues that affect all of us.
I'd like to recognize Sandy Galiff, who has a question or a comment.
Hey, Brent, my
Hi.
comment, I always learn more, and I've heard you so often. It's like, there's so much information to impart to all of us. So, and I appreciate all the programs that you've done, throughout the years to engage all of us. But I just have a question, when somebody comes to the museum, when we're either full blown or partly, operational, they're going to see the cell block, which you've talked about, when we get the state permission to do that. But what happens when they walk in the door of the museum? What kind of
Mhm.
things will they see or
Well,
participate in?
yeah, I think that's a great question, Sandy. And what we're thinking about is using our mission as a way of guiding what the visitor will see. So when you walk into a preview center, even though it's a small space, there will be a timeline that will lay out the history of Sing Sing, much in the way I did tonight, using these amazing images we have. And we have hundreds of photographs, so it'll be difficult choice to decide what we will display, and we'll probably rotate that illustrated timeline. That'll be on one wall. On another wall, we'll introduce visitors to the organizations that are involved now in criminal justice reform, Hudson Link, Rehabilitation Through the Arts, the Osborne Association, the Fortune Society. There are dozens of really important organizations that are doing great work that most people have no idea that they exist, and hopefully will encourage people to be involved in improving the criminal justice system in this country. So I think that will be the basic visitor experience, is an introduction to history and an introduction to the contemporary issues and the organizations that are doing something about it.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and one of them is the women's prison building still standing? When did that one come down?
The women's prison is not still standing. It came down in, I believe, in the 1920s, and it is the prison chapel is the location of where the women's prison wants to. We believe that there's foundations and some archaeological evidence around that site that would be interesting to look at in the future.
And I see that Jody Glass has asked, does the museum speak to the issue of racism, misogyny, homophobia in some way? Sounds like the performances do.
Well, we do have, we had recently in June during Pride Month, we had a program on the issue of identity, gender identity, sexual identity in the prisons and protecting people. Legislation that has come out along those lines. We have had programs about Black history in Ossining and at Sing Sing. And we have fortunately been working with a number of people who were formerly incarcerated, who have been helping us identify those issues and how we can bring them out into the open and have an open discussion about some of these issues. So we definitely plan to continue through our webinars and through our public programming and our collections to address those issues.
I have a question. Let me turn the video on. I'm very proud to have been part of the board for a while. And one of the things that I think connects people, this sort of goes to what Sandy's talking about. When people come into the museum, the desire for any citizen is to feel safer on the planet, to feel safer in the world. And I believe that so many of the programs that are now at Sing Sing, whether it's the Osborne Society or it's the educational programs or it's rehabilitation through the art, has the opportunity for people who are now incarcerated, hopefully formally incarcerated soon, to go out and be productive and help create a safer place, both for not only them, but for the people in their communities, for their families, and to begin to change, and this is in response to Jody's question, the stigmatism, that people are stigmatized coming from a place of incarceration. And then I think the museum can actually help change that perception profoundly. So I think that the work of the museum will have a good impact and could become a model for other prison organizations around the country and the world, hopefully.
I agree, Rochelle, and I think there is a commitment, as you know, on our Board of Trustees to continue to push the museum in the direction of becoming more of a center for justice, for the study of justice in this country. So while history, and you know I'm a historian, history is a resource for us, I think the emphasis on demystifying the subject of incarceration and calling attention to the humanity of the people who are impacted by the justice system is definitely a very high priority.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? It was a marvelous presentation. I learned so much. I was really thrilled to hear some things that I didn't know about. I never really understood the cell block until you walked me through that plan. And I was delighted about the little orchestra that was formed, and what was it, the Mutual Welfare League?
Yes.
Love that. I think Ms. Farnham lived on Ellis Place, I believe, here in
really?
Austining. And but I learned so much, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions out there? Doug, did you have some things to say?
No, I'm good, but thank you, because we were planning on having Brent talk for a long time. We finally got it together between us and between him to make this happen. And I think it's something that maybe we revisit again when there's more progress or learn more, or we can all get involved. So that'd be great.
Right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending. Please make sure you check in at jugtavern.org. Oh, we got a couple of new comments. So they're mostly thank yous. We do have one question though. We did record this, Brent. Do you allow us to put it on our website?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So
Yes.
that's one answer. So the video will be available. We actually
I see one other question. What's the name of the film? It's I think the name is Sing Sing Thanksgiving 1972. But you can go on YouTube and see excerpts from the film. If you put in Sing Sing Prison and Joan Baez, or Sing Sing Prison and B.B. King, you'll see some performances from that that amazing concert.
That's so exciting to be able to see that.
Thank
All
you.
right. If there are no other questions or comments,
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
And thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Brent.
Bye, Martha.
Bye-bye. Margaret, I think you have to stop the recording.